The silence in the courtroom was so absolute it felt like a physical weight, pressing down on everyone, suffocating the air. The only thing you could hear was the frantic, terrified thumping of my own heart. The judge, a woman who radiated an aura of unshakable authority, just stared, her mouth slightly agape. The gavel in her hand, the symbol of her power and judgment, seemed to have forgotten its purpose, hovering uselessly over the rich, dark wood of the bench as if frozen in time. A whisper escaped her lips, yet it carried to every corner of the silent room. "In all my years on this bench," she breathed, her voice filled with a stunned, chilling disbelief, I have never witnessed anything of this magnitude." Her eyes weren't on the lawyers or the gallery. They were locked on the evidence before her, and on me. Before I continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, comment below, and leave your like. Helps a lot. My adoptive mother, Linda, the woman who had once cradled my face in her hands and promised me a forever home, looked as though she had just seen a legion of ghosts rise from the courtroom floor. Her carefully constructed mask of poise and victimhood had shattered, leaving behind a pallid, raw terror. Her husband, Mark, sat rigid beside her, the smug, condescending grin that had been a permanent fixture on his face for as long as I could remember finally, blessedly, wiped away. They had walked in here with their heads held high, confident in their power, their status, and their lies. They were utterly convinced they had won, that they were just moments away from finalizing the disposal of me, like a piece of worn-out, inconvenient furniture they no longer had a use for. But their arrogance had blinded them. They had absolutely no conception of the truths I had painstakingly unearthed. They were oblivious to the fact that the past they had so meticulously and cruelly buried was about to claw its way out of its shallow grave and drag them down into the darkness. And it all began 15 years earlier, inside the walls of a house that I once believed, with every fiber of my hopeful 6-year-old being, was my true home. My name is Aisha. And for me, the memory of being chosen is as vivid, as sharp, and as painful as the memory of being discarded. I was 6 years old, another face in the blur of the foster system. A life defined by a succession of temporary rooms, temporary beds, and hopeful goodbyes that always, inevitably, ended in just goodbyes. I was a child with enormous, curious eyes that tried to soak in the world, and a heart so full of unspent hope it felt like a frantic butterfly perpetually beating its wings against the cage of my ribs. I just wanted a place to land. When Linda and Mark first entered that sterile, impersonal visitation room, they seemed to have stepped directly from the glossy pages of a high-end magazine. They were the picture of success. Wealthy, impeccably dressed, residing in a sprawling mansion in an exclusive suburb, and pillars of their influential church community. Their smiles were wide and brilliant, but they seemed practiced, perfected for photographs rather than born from genuine warmth. They saw me and they decided I would be theirs. "We are going to give you the stable, loving family you have always deserved, sweetie," Linda had whispered to me at the adoption hearing, her voice like honey. She squeezed my small hand, but the gesture felt less like a comforting embrace and more like an act of possession, of claiming property. I didn't care. To my 6-year-old mind, property was permanent, and permanence was the only thing in the world I craved. The life they gave me was, at first, a fairy tale. They filled my closet with beautiful dresses of silk and velvet, and shiny patent leather shoes that made satisfying clicking sounds on the polished hardwood floors of their colossal house. For the first 2 years, I was living in a dream I was terrified of waking up from. I was given my own bedroom, a sanctuary painted in a soft, dreamy lavender. It had a magnificent canopy bed that made me feel like a princess and more fluffy, smiling stuffed animals than my small arms could ever hope to hug at once. I was their daughter, their precious little miracle. I was the story they told their friends, the living proof of their boundless charity and goodness. And then Tommy was born. It wasn't an abrupt change, not like a light switch being flipped. It was a slow, creeping frost that began at the edges of my world and gradually moved inward. In the beginning, you understand. Course you do. A new baby is fragile and demanding. He needs constant attention. I was determined to be the best big sister imaginable. I would tiptoe around the house when he was sleeping, fetch diapers without being asked, and hum the lullabies I vaguely remembered from some long-ago place. But my efforts went unnoticed, and the frost began to set in. The beautiful dresses stopped appearing. My lavender sanctuary was repainted a sterile, lifeless beige and transformed into Mark's home office. My belongings were moved into a small, cold guest room at the far end of the hall, a room that felt transient by its very nature. My birthday parties, which had once been grand affairs with bouncy castles and dozens of friends, dwindled to a single lonely cupcake bought from a grocery store, its candle extinguished with a perfunctory, distracted song. Meanwhile, Tommy's first birthday featured a live band and a petting zoo grazing on the perfectly manicured front lawn. The cruelty didn't begin with a shout. It began with a subtle, dismissive nudge. I was 8 years old. We were all seated at the enormous dining table, a piece of furniture so large it could have hosted a banquet. Mark would be carving a glistening roast, and the smell would make my perpetually empty stomach ache with hunger. As I would tentatively reach for the bowl of mashed potatoes, his elbow would just connect with my arm, nudging it back. It wasn't violent, not then. It was just enough to be a clear, unmistakable message. Let Tommy get his fill first, Aisha. He's a growing boy, he'd say with a chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. Linda would then pointedly slide a bowl of limp, overcooked green beans in front of me. You can have as many of these as you like, she'd say, her gaze sharp and critical. You need to watch your figure after all. I was a scrawny, underfed child, all sharp angles and hollows. But overnight I was put on a diet. Linda's eyes became my personal police force, monitoring every single bite that entered my mouth. One small scoop of potatoes was my ration, while Tommy, my junior by 2 years, was loudly praised as he devoured second and third helpings of everything. His face would be a gleeful mess of gravy and the rich chocolate pie I was never ever allowed to touch. One evening my throat was parched. I reached for the heavy glass pitcher of water in the center of the table. This time Linda's elbow shot out with surprising speed and jabbed me hard in the ribs. The unexpected force made me stumble backward, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Clumsy girl," she hissed, her voice dripping with irritation. She didn't even look at me. Her full attention was already back on spoon-feeding Tommy a bite of his dessert, her face a mask of maternal devotion. Lying in my cold bed in the guest room later that night, I could hear their laughter floating up from downstairs. It was a warm, golden circle of light and love, and I was on the outside, shivering in the dark. The gnawing hunger in my stomach was a familiar physical pain, but the hunger for a kind word, a gentle look, for the simple feeling that I belonged, that I wasn't an intruder in my own home, that was an agony that eclipsed everything else. That's when the toxic questions began to plant their roots in my mind. What did I do wrong? Am I not good enough? Am I just unlovable? Is it my skin? In their perfect porcelain white world, was I, their adopted black child, a blemish they were now trying to erase? That elbow wasn't just an elbow. It was a physical manifestation of a constant, brutal message. My place was on the sidelines. I was to be invisible, silent, and pathetically grateful for whatever scraps of food or affection they chose to toss my way. Moving from the guest room to the attic wasn't presented as a punishment. It was, they claimed, a practical decision. I was 9 years old when Tommy, their biological son, required a dedicated playroom for the ever-growing mountain of expensive toys they showered upon him. The guest room, my room, was the only logical spot. And so, I carried my few belongings up a narrow, creaking staircase, into a dusty, forgotten storage space at the very top of the house. It was an icebox in the winter and a suffocating oven in the summer. A single, grimy window, webbed with cracks, looked out over the backyard where Tommy played. The message couldn't have been more brutally clear. I was being physically and emotionally pushed further and further to the margins of the family, exiled to the highest, most isolated point of the house. The memory of my lavender room felt like a story from someone else's life. My new reality was the smell of dust and decay, and the lonely sound of the wind whistling through the eaves. My world, already small, began to shrink even further. They systematically started severing my connections to the outside world, ensuring I had no one to turn to. I had managed to make a best friend at school, a wonderful girl named Sarah who didn't care that my clothes were secondhand and always a little too small. When I gathered the courage to ask if she could come over to play, Linda's face hardened into a stiff, cold mask. "I don't think that's a good idea. We don't know her family," she said with an air of finality. It was a lie, and I knew it. A week later, Linda called Sarah's mother and spun a web of horrific tales, painting me as a deeply troubled child, with a history of stealing and compulsive lying. The next day at school, Sarah wouldn't meet my eyes. She flinched away when I approached her, her face a mixture of fear and confusion. The silent, public rejection shattered what was left of my heart. When I expressed a desperate desire to join the school choir, a place where I might have found a voice, Mark refused to sign the permission form. "Your chores are more important," he stated flatly, his eyes never leaving his newspaper. They were meticulously constructing an invisible prison around me, brick by invisible brick, making absolutely certain I had no allies, no witnesses, no one to tell. The bruises became more frequent and harder to explain away as childish clumsiness. The abuse evolved beyond accidental elbows at the dinner table. It became a hard shove against a doorframe for being too slow with my chores, or Linda's sharp fingernails digging mercilessly into the soft flesh of my arm as she dragged me up the stairs to the attic. One day, during gym class, my PE teacher, Mrs. Davison, a kind woman with watchful eyes, noticed a pattern of dark, mottled bruises on my upper arm. She gently pulled me aside after class, her face etched with concern, and asked what had happened. A thick, paralyzing fear clogged my throat. The words I needed to say were right there, but Linda and Mark's threats echoed louder in my head. I just mumbled something pathetic about falling down the stairs. She didn't believe me for a second. Her frown deepened, and she made a call. A few days later, a car I didn't recognize pulled into the driveway, and a woman from Child Protective Services came to the door. For a dizzying moment, my heart soared with a desperate hope. Was this it? Was someone finally going to see the truth and save me? But Linda and Mark were masters of deception. They greeted the caseworker with warm, concerned smiles, ushering her into their immaculate living room and offering her coffee and pastries. They were the very picture of loving, devoted parents pushed to their limits. "Aisha has some very deep-seated issues," Linda began, her voice dripping with a flawless, practiced sadness. "We knew when we adopted an older child that there would be challenges. Her birth mother. Well, there were drugs involved, you understand. Aisha has a tendency to fabricate elaborate stories to get attention. And she is so terribly clumsy." Mark nodded, his expression a perfect mimicry of sorrowful agreement. "She injures herself and then spins these wild, fantastical tales. We love her to death, but honestly, it's been a real, heartbreaking struggle for our family." The caseworker listened, nodding sympathetically. She glanced at me, but her eyes slid over me as if I were part of the furniture. She saw a wealthy, respectable, charitable white couple and a troubled, difficult little black girl. You could almost see the narrative writing itself in her head, the conclusion already reached. She asked me a few perfunctory questions while my adoptive parents stared at me, their eyes cold and full of warning. My answers were choked, whispered fragments that died in my throat. She bought their story hook, line, and sinker. She scribbled some notes in her book, offered them a few pamphlets, and left. The second that front door clicked shut, the warmth evaporated from Linda's face as if it had never been there. The air turned icy. That night, Mark cornered me in the kitchen as I was cleaning up. "You want to tell lies about us," he seethed, his voice a low, menacing hiss. This time, his elbow didn't just nudge. It slammed into my side with the full force of his body, knocking the wind completely out of me. A bright, searing, hot pain exploded through my chest. I crumpled to the cold tile floor, gasping for air that wouldn't come. I had cracked a rib. I spent the next month in agony, learning to take shallow, careful breaths, wearing baggy sweaters to hide the old scarf I had wrapped tightly around my torso as a makeshift bandage. The sickening, constant throb of pain was a grim reminder. No one was coming to save me. I was utterly and completely on my own. If you're still here with me, don't forget to subscribe, activate notifications, leave your like, and share this video with someone. Survival meant becoming a ghost in my own home. I perfected the art of moving through the house without making a sound, a shadow flitting through the periphery. I learned to read the subtle shifts in their moods, to anticipate the storms and make myself scarce. Some nights, the hunger was so intense I would sneak downstairs after they were asleep and pull leftover crusts of bread or vegetable peelings from the trash can, eating them in the dark before scurrying back to my attic prison. I started to wonder if they were right. Maybe I was broken. Maybe I was bad. Maybe I deserved this. When I was 10, I sliced my finger open while washing a heavy pot. I knew better than to ask for a bandage, so I decided to risk sneaking into Mark's office, my old lavender room, to find one myself. My heart hammered against my ribs as I crept into the room. It still smelled faintly of lavender, a ghost of a life that was no longer mine. In the back of a deep desk drawer, tucked away beneath a stack of old tax papers, my fingers brushed against a manila file. The name on the tab wasn't mine. It read, in Linda's neat cursive, Mia. With trembling hands I pulled it out. Inside was a collection of letters and official-looking documents. They were about another little girl, Mia, whom they had adopted at the exact same age as me. As I read, a horrifyingly familiar story emerged. The reports detailed how she, too, had suddenly developed severe behavioral issues shortly after her adoption. There were notes from her school expressing concern that she appeared malnourished, followed by scathing letters from Linda and Mark to the principal, claiming Mia was a compulsive liar who was trying to sabotage their family. And then, at the very bottom of the file, was the last piece of paper, an official relinquishment form. It stated that Mia had been returned to the foster care system after she had supposedly run away during a family vacation. The form was dated just 6 months before they adopted me. My hands started to shake uncontrollably. It wasn't just me. This wasn't about me being bad or broken. This was a system. A sick, twisted, repeating pattern. A cold dread washed over me as 1,000 questions flooded my mind. Who was Mia? Where was she now? And the most terrifying question of all, was that my destiny? To be used up, broken, and then thrown out to make room for the next girl? I knew I couldn't confront them. It would be my word against theirs, and I knew whose they would believe. But there was Tommy. He was 8 now, spoiled and arrogant, but he was my brother. Or so I thought. I found him in his playroom, surrounded by a universe of toys. I held out the file, my hand shaking. Tommy, I whispered. Who is Mia? He barely glanced at it, his eyes glued to his video game. Oh, her. He sneered with a casual cruelty that stole my breath. She was the one before you. Mom and Dad say you're not real family anyway. You're just here for the tax money, just like she was. You're temporary. Temporary. Tax write-off. The words were more brutal than any physical blow. They sliced through the last fragile thread of hope I had been clinging to, and it all came crashing down. I was nothing to them but a financial calculation. What could I possibly do? If I ran to the authorities again, would they believe a 10-year-old with a wild story over the word of 2 wealthy, respected community leaders? The risk of what they would do to me if I failed was immense. But saying nothing felt like I was helping them shovel the dirt onto my own grave. And so, I chose to be silent. I chose to survive. Now. By the time I was 13, the pretense was gone entirely. I wasn't their daughter. I was the unpaid help. They took a cruel pleasure in assigning me what they called farm chores, a ridiculous term for the back-breaking labor I was forced to do in their perfectly landscaped suburban yard. Every morning before the sun was up, I was outside scrubbing the sprawling stone patio, hauling heavy bags of mulch from one end of the property to the other, and pulling weeds from the endless flower beds until my fingers were raw and bleeding. All while Tommy slept in until noon and then spent his day playing video games and eating snacks. Linda's elbows had long been replaced by open-handed slaps. If I slowed my pace for even a moment, she would materialize beside me. Useless, she'd spit. the word laced with venom, sometimes giving me a hard shove that sent me stumbling into the mud. I was painfully thin and small for my age, my growth stunted from years of chronic malnutrition and exhausting physical labor. They even found a way to systematically erase me from their public life. Mark, in his quest for more influence at their church, started a family vlog to showcase their perfect, idyllic Christian life. He became an expert at framing the camera to keep me just out of shot. If I happened to be in the background by accident, he would meticulously edit me out, as if I never existed. He posted one video that included me, a carefully staged clip where I was shown playfully chasing Tommy across the lawn. The reality was that he had ordered me to run after him for the camera, and they had simply edited out the look of utter exhaustion and desperation on my face. At night, in the attic, I would press my ear to the floorboards, straining to hear their muffled conversations from the master bedroom below. Their whispers were often about me. "She's getting too old now. It's almost time to start the process." I spoke to that private agency again. They said we'll get a very good payment for an older, healthy child. My blood ran cold. They weren't just going to return me to the system like they did with Mia. They were going to sell me. They were planning to profit from my disposal, just as they had profited from my presence. I found the final damning proof when I was 15. During a rare moment when the house was empty, I found a small, locked metal box hidden in the back of their walk-in closet. I had once seen where Linda hid the key, and with my heart pounding a deafening rhythm against my ribs, I retrieved it and opened the box. Inside, it wasn't just Mia's things. There were papers and photographs for 2 other girls. Usha, all of them black. All adopted around age 6 or 7. All relinquished, due to behavioral problems, around age 10 or 11. And in the faded school pictures, they all had the same haunted, hollowed-out look in their eyes that I saw staring back at me in the mirror every day. Then one picture of Mia made me stop breathing. Held it close. Her face. It wasn't just familiar. It was my face. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile. It looked so much like mine. In that instant, the years of fear and submission burned away, replaced by something cold, hard, and sharp. These people weren't just cruel, they were monsters. They were running a sophisticated, horrifying scam, cycling through vulnerable foster children, collecting state subsidies, exploiting them for labor, and then trafficking them through shady private agencies for a final, disgusting profit. That very night, I heard the final detail that sealed my plan. "We'll do it next month," Mark said, his voice clear through the floorboards. "Right after the annual church fundraiser. We'll tell everyone she ran away. It's the perfect tragic story. It will only increase the sympathy for us." Next month. I had less than 30 days before I was scheduled to disappear just like the others. All those years of fear, of hunger, of desperate loneliness, all coalesced into a single sharp point of focus. I was not going to be another ghost in their box of horrors. I was going to take a match to their perfect world and burn it to the ground. That night I didn't just run. I ran with a purpose. I ran straight to the one house on the street where the owner, Mrs. Hargrove, always gave me a sad, knowing look over the fence. I pounded on her front door, and when she opened it, the entire ugly 15-year story finally came pouring out. The weeks that followed were a maelstrom of police stations, social workers' offices, and endless, exhausting questions. Mrs. Hargrove had immediately called the police, and this time everything was different. I was no longer a small, scared child spinning fantastical tales. I was 15 years old, articulate, and I had names. Mia, Keisha, Tasha. Armed with my story, the police secured a warrant. When they found the locked metal box in the closet, Linda and Mark were arrested. They immediately hired a high-powered, expensive lawyer who began painting a public picture of me as a disturbed, vindictive teenager hell-bent on destroying the lives of 2 community saints. I was placed in a safe, emergency foster home with a kind woman who didn't watch every bite I took. I had my own room with a clean, warm bed, and for the first time in nearly a decade, I ate 3 full meals a day. But I couldn't relax. The anger simmered inside me like a fire, But beneath it was a deep, aching guilt for the part of me that, even after everything, had still so desperately wanted their love. And I was terrified. What if their money and influence bought their way out of this? What if they got away with it all over again? The day of the custody hearing arrived. Linda and Mark walked into the courtroom radiating an aura of wronged innocence. Linda was dressed in a modest, expensive dress and wore pearls, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. "We gave that child everything," she cried on the stand, her voice breaking artfully. "We loved her as our own. But she has a darkness in her, a deep-seated pathology." I could feel the doubt rippling through the room, the power of their performance. But then my court-appointed lawyer began. She presented my medical records, the documented history of malnourishment, the X-rays showing old, improperly healed fractures, including the cracked rib. She called Mrs. Hargrove to the stand, who testified with quiet dignity about seeing me performing hours of hard labor in the yard, day after day, in all weather. The first cracks in their perfect facade began to appear. Then it was my turn. My voice was shaky at first, a mere whisper, but as I spoke it grew stronger, fueled by years of silenced truth. I told them everything. The attic, the constant hunger, elbows, the vlog, box, names. When I mentioned Mia, Keisha, and Tasha, Mark's lawyer leaped to his feet. "Objection. This is a work of fiction from a deeply troubled adolescent." "Then let's examine the fiction, shall we?" my lawyer retorted calmly. A bailiff brought the metal box forward and placed it on the evidence table. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom as he opened it. But the most profound reaction came from the judge herself. As she sifted through the documents, the photographs of those hollow-eyed little girls, all the color drained from her face. "There's more," I said, my voice now ringing out clear and steady. While I was in foster care on a desperate whim, I had used a small allowance to send my DNA to an ancestry website, praying for a miracle. And I had gotten one. "The girl in those papers," I said, locking eyes with Linda. "The first one, Mia. She wasn't just some other girl you abused and threw away. She is my biological sister." The room erupted. Linda began to sob, real, hysterical sobs this time. "It's a lie. It's all a vicious lie," she shrieked. "Is it?" my lawyer asked the court. "Your Honor, we have one more witness." A large screen behind me flickered to life, and a face appeared via video call. It was her. Older, her face thinner and etched with hardship, but it was undeniably the face from the photograph. It was my face. "My name is Mia," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "And everything my sister Aisha is saying is the absolute truth. They starved me, they worked me like an animal, and when they were done with me, they sold me to another couple through a private agency. They told me my entire family was dead." The courtroom descended into chaos. Linda was screaming incoherently, and Mark was shouting about lawsuits, but it all came to a screeching halt with the deafening, explosive crack of the gavel. "Enough!" the judge's voice boomed, shaking with enrage that seemed to emanate from her very core. "Based on the evidence and testimony presented here today," she said, her own voice trembling with emotion, "I must immediately and unequivocally recuse myself from this case. A severe and irreconcilable conflict of interest has become apparent." She called for a recess. When we were called back an hour later, a different judge was sitting on the bench. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, during the recess, we received a new sworn witness statement." The statement was from the original judge. In it, she confessed that Linda and Mark were her first cousins. Years ago, when she was a junior prosecutor in that same district, a complaint file regarding a girl named Tasha, one of the girls from the box, had crossed her desk. To protect her family's reputation, she had buried it. She wrote that she had believed their lies back then, but seeing my case, hearing my testimony, seeing the undeniable, horrific pattern repeated, she knew she had to come forward. Her statement confirmed she had already launched her own quiet inquiry, which had begun to uncover a vast web of abuse, fraud, and child trafficking, all masterfully hidden behind her cousin's pristine public image. The new judge's face was grim. "Bailiffs," he commanded, his voice cold as steel, "take the defendants into custody." As the handcuffs clicked around their wrists, their faces were masks of pure, uncomprehending shock. My lawyer delivered the final, devastating blow, presenting a tiny hidden camera I'd bought with saved-up lunch money from my new foster home. I had given it to Mrs. Hargrove, who had aimed it at their yard. The memory card contained weeks of footage of their casual cruelty, their chilling neglect, and their conversations about my impending disposal. It was over. Truly over. As they were being led away, a woman who had been sitting at the very back of the courtroom began pushing her way through the crowd. Her eyes were locked on me, and on Mia's face, still frozen on the screen. She was older, her face lined with the exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless nights, but her eyes, they were my eyes. They were Mia's eyes. It was our mother. She was clean now, healthy, and had spent every year since we were taken from her trying to navigate the bureaucracy to find the daughter she had never stopped loving. She rushed forward, and for the first time in my entire conscious memory, I was pulled into an embrace that wasn't about ownership or control. It was just love. Pure, unconditional, overwhelming love. As my mom and I held each other and wept, with my sister watching through the screen across the miles, tears streaming down her face as well, the years of pain didn't magically disappear. But they were finally counterbalanced by a wave of freedom and belonging so powerful it made my knees weak. I had walked into that courtroom a ghost, a temporary thing they had elbowed aside and tried to erase. But I walked out whole. I walked out with a sister I thought was lost forever, a mother I never knew I had, and a future that was, for the very first time, entirely mine to write. The cycle was broken. I was no longer a shadow. I was Aisha, and my real story was just beginning. Thank you for listening to my story. Please subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, comment below, leave your like, and share this video with others.